It is actually a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I hope that this session will be informative for everyone. I know that some of you are students and some of you that will be watching the recording might be in actually corporations or startups. So I'm trying to make it relevant for everyone. Okay, so as Isra mentioned, I have more than 10 years experience in project management in different companies. I've been working with the global startup ecosystem for over 8 years. And I'm also a startup mentor with the IE Business School Venture Lab in Madrid. Worked with the Cartier Women's Initiatives with their startups. And I'm also a coach with EXO Works, which is a global consulting and coaching company based out of the US with projects in different countries in the world. So what I'm going to do today is basically share with you my experience and share with you the strategies, the corporate innovation examples and case studies, and why do we need corporate innovation? And I will also share the strategies and the models of corporate innovations in companies. So feel free to ask me any questions after that. You can also ask me questions during the session. I will try to keep an eye on the chat as I move along because I'm moving between the two tabs. So, okay, so we have a small audience here, but I would just like to start the session by asking you just a general question to gauge how much you know about the space and just to make this more interesting for everyone. So who do you think has contributed the most impactful innovations over the last 30 years? Is it the startups, the entrepreneurs leading startups, or the large companies? Feel free to write in the chat number 1 or number 2, just to see what do you all think. Okay, Dr. Isra, startups. Okay. Abdulrahman, leading startups. Okay. Fatma, also startups. Okay, anyone else? Okay, so according to the book, Driving Innovation from Within, over 70% of transformative innovations are conceived, developed, and commercialized by employees working within large companies. Now, you are right that startups are making a huge impact in the world. They're making huge disruptions within so many industries. But at the same time, what I want you to take out of this is the potential for large companies, because they have the resources, the funding, the access to the market, the strong brand names. They have these capabilities to come up with startup-like initiatives to be implemented and make a huge impact and have a higher rate of success. We might see that, maybe those transformative innovations will come from startups and companies alike in the near future. Yeah, you can go 50-50. But what I'm trying to bring to your attention here is the potential for large organizations, and this is the topic I'm talking about, is how can companies act like startups, but also achieve exponential growth and exponential transformation. Okay, so why are we talking about corporate innovation? So corporate innovation has been there for a while, but mostly in the US. It started out in Silicon Valley, mainly because we knew that startups were disrupting corporations, so they really wanted to see what they can do to act like startups. But recently, especially in the Middle East, we're seeing that this is becoming a very famous or popular term, corporate innovation, because mainly we have the potential to really innovate within companies, especially here in our region. And so we're seeing that startups are disrupting corporates. We're seeing the cost of new technologies is going down, and we're seeing that companies want to retain their market share or grow their market share. So if they don't disrupt themselves, someone else is going to disrupt them. So they're better off investing in those corporate innovation initiatives, projects, or startups. And I'll be talking about how and what does that look like later on. So this is Peter Diamandis. This is his photo actually from Bahrain Arabian Business Investors Forum back in 2019, just before the pandemic. Peter is the founder of Singularity University in NASA Park, and he also coined the term of 6 Ds of tech disruption. So what he means by the 6 Ds of tech disruption, he says that anything that is digitized at the beginning will go through a phase where you won't really notice the disruptions that this technology or this product that's being digitized. But there will come a time where we notice the disruption, and then you will notice that it's becoming less expensive and this will be accessible to everyone. Let me give you an example. So a lot of you know about 3D printing. So 3D printing has been around for more than 30 years, but we only came to know about it mainly in the last 5 years or maybe 10 years. What 3D printing is doing is actually disrupting a $10 trillion market of manufacturing industry. So the disruption is huge, and we didn't notice that until recently, that 3D printing is being used to build homes, it's being used in healthcare, it's being used in retail, in inventory. And you can see that if I can go back to Peter's graph here, is that now it passed the deceptive stage, it's in the disruptive stage and the demonetizing. Eventually, if you can have 3D built houses, you can have the house, for example, 10,000 dinars, which can be accessible, more accessible to many people than the current market. And that goes to many other examples. So just giving the example of 3D printing and houses, but that can be applied to many examples. And taking the 6 Ds example throughout the session, you will notice the trend. So you're either becoming a software company or you're being disrupted by one. You don't digitize, you don't innovate, you're going to be disrupted. I also want to talk about the difference between innovation and digitization. While digital transformation is important, innovation is different. It's not just digital transformation. It's not just making something, adding technology to something. Innovation can be in different things. It could be the business model. It could be innovating the user experience. For example, if you take Uber, it didn't really use that breakthrough technology, but at the same time, it innovated the way the customers experience the taxi ride, right? So that's not the same thing with Airbnb and most of the startups, is that they're innovating the customer experience, either through innovative business models or through technology or both. And if you take the famous example of Kodak, back in 1975, Steve Sanson here invented the digital camera in Kodak. And the company refused to launch it simply because they thought it's going to cannibalize their current products and services. Well, this is, maybe this is the normal reaction in companies, but then what we know is that Kodak went bankrupt. And had they invested in this or they launched it, they would have been in a much better case than they are at the moment. And so what happens when you try to innovate inside of a company? Salim Ismail is the author of Exponential Organizations, and he says, when you attempt disruptive innovation inside a big company, its immune system will attack you. How many times did you try to come up with an idea? I don't know if you're a student, maybe not yet, but if you are working, how many times did you try to come up with a new idea and in your company, and it was killed, by the company, just thinking that it's too audacious or unrealistic, or it could cost a lot of money, could be a waste of time. While, this is what we call the immune system. It's kind of protective to the status quo, protective of, how they're used to be working, their comfort zone. They don't want to expand and they don't want to disrupt it. But eventually this disruption is going to happen. And so I'll give you some strategies later on and how can you deal with this immune system and what are the examples as well. Another famous example is Amazon. So, Amazon is started as selling books online, but eventually started selling other products and services. But what they did, they also launched the Amazon Web Services, which is completely different than the services that they provide to the core business. So that's absolutely fine. And it's actually encouraged for companies to think, how can they come up with ideas that are completely different? You could be a bank and you could disrupt something in education. You could be a cargo company disrupting supply chain. You could be insurance company disrupting healthcare, for example. So it could be disruptions can be anywhere, and it gives you a better market share. So AWS actually gives Amazon more than 60% of their company's operating profits. So it generates more than 60% of that. So that gives you the idea of how big the potential is for us to come up with all those ideas that can be innovative. Another famous example is the Google X Lab cars. So Google X Labs is their innovation lab within Google. So they thought, okay, there will be a time where cars will be self-driving cars. Why don't we try to disrupt that rather than wait for it to be disrupted? And they also noticed that they can leverage their data, their algorithms, their current resources into building those cars. And that makes a lot of sense for them. So I just want to pause here to see if you have any questions. Please let me know in the chat before I continue. Okay. Okay, I assume there are no questions. So I'm going to share with you some case studies on projects that I've been working on and how companies are innovating or implementing corporate innovation. But before that, I want to make a point here, whereas the success rate can be higher when you have a huge problem and not a small problem, right? So with corporate innovation, don't think small, think of a huge problem. And like we say with startups, we usually say that fall in love with a problem, don't fall in love with the solution. The same goes with corporate innovation. So have a really huge problem that people wanted to be solved, and then have a radical solution and a breakthrough technology. And this is your sweet spot here, where you can have a really higher success rate and potential for something big to happen. So I'll share an example in the UAE, in Dubai specifically, with Alip Construction. So this is a construction company, a huge construction company that I've worked with in 2019 with the EXOWorks team. And we've created a 10 weeks program for them to come up with ideas to disrupt the industry and to think a more entrepreneurial way. So first of all, we looked at the challenges. What are the challenges of the construction industry in Dubai? What is the situation? And we know that the real estate sector contributes to 7% of Dubai's GDP. However, there's a huge amount of empty spaces. There is much more supply than there is demand. And this is the trend that is currently growing. But we see this also as an opportunity to leverage those empty spaces, to innovate, to come up with ideas to use those empty spaces. There's also challenges with the health and safety of the labor workers. There's a lot of waste and emissions. There are so many cheaper alternatives at the moment. Go back to the example of the 3D printed house. And there's lack of technology adoption in the sector, lower margins, working in silos. And then what if we adopt more technologies? We need to reskill and upskill the workforce. So for example, Amazon is currently selling entire houses for less than $20,000. You can actually search for that. It is not a 3D printed house, but it's a modular house. It's also a disruption. So disruption is not just from technology, it can be from anywhere. And so these houses are actually not very fancy, but very affordable for people that don't want to or cannot afford to spend on a house or don't want to take a mortgage loan. And so that's really disrupting so many industries, disrupting banks for the loans, disrupting manufacturing. And so, we need to think ahead. Even though we don't have this yet in the market, we really need to start thinking ahead. And so this is some of the work we've done with them. We looked at the technologies and the business models. There's the sharing economy. You have shared spaces, the shared storage. For example, if you look at the value of self-storage market worldwide, in 2020, it was $48 billion US. In 2026, it is expected to be around $65 billion US. So the potential is huge. Even though you have empty spaces, what I'm trying to say is that you can have the potential to use those empty spaces and generate revenue out of it. Then you have new technologies such as VR, AR, digital twins to reduce the rework, ecosystem platforms. Imagine you have the Google Drive or the Google Workspace for construction, which you have different elements and all working together. And this is the way startups think, basically. So an ecosystem platform is a relatively new business model that's proven to be successful for large organizations and large industries. You can use data analytics for inventory management, 3D printing, and robotics. And this is only some of the technologies and business models. But what we did was we looked with them at these new technologies, we looked at the potential, and we came up with 8 different initiatives. 2 of these initiatives were the modular houses, where they decided to go for modular houses, and the other initiative is the ecosystem platform. And if I can share here, this is the ecosystem platform they came up with. And it's actually the founder of this is an employee, a junior employee that was working in the company. And see, this is the way that we implement corporate innovation. We don't implement it inside of the company. We implement it outside of the company so that the immune system does not attack our initiative. And so going from an junior to mid-level employee, becoming a founder of this initiative on the edge of the organization or outside of the organization. And this is a platform for pre-construction, procurement, supply chain, contracts, and also access to professionals that are available, whether they are interior designers, whether they're architects, whether they're freelancers or consultants, small consultants. That really opens up the market, and the potential for this is huge. Another example is the Agritech in the Philippines. So this is something I'm currently working on, so I will not share a lot due to confidentiality, but I will share with you what are the technologies and business models and the potential for the food system, actually, the food supply chain system. So when we looked at the challenges in the Philippines, for example, we noticed that 11% of their GDP comes from agriculture. So there's an opportunity there. However, tons of food is wasted due to inefficient supply chain, lack of cold storage, transforming the food, whether it's fresh produce or vegetables, fruits, from the rural areas to the urban cities is by the time they reach the cities, it could be spoiled or due to heat, etc. So we looked at the whole supply chain and the efficiencies, and we also noticed that the farmers hardly break even. So what if we can come up with an idea that can actually improve their GDP, significantly reduce food wasted, improve farmers' lives, and improve efficiencies? So that's really something that with corporate innovation we can actually do. So the technologies and business models include IoT sensors for food. These actually exist. You can have sensors placed in the food while it's being transported. You can track, you can monitor the quality of the food. There's also vertical farming where you have, you can leverage spaces in the city, empty spaces, and you can turn them into vertical farms. That reduces the inefficiencies in the supply chain. You can have the Uberization for food transport. You can also manage supply and demand. Maybe you are growing too much of something, and maybe you need more of something else, and that with artificial intelligence, with data, we'll be able to predict that in the future. There's also the use of drones for agriculture and precision farming, and improving the yield for the farmers. So what we were able to achieve is really reduce poverty, reduce hunger, and create new revenue streams for the company and have higher exports. Okay, so this is the last example. Actually, this is not something that I really worked on, but this is something very difficult to hack, which is healthcare and health insurance. However, the health insurance market is very ripe for disruption. So if we don't do something right now, we might notice that insurance companies will be disrupted in the next 5 years if they don't innovate and try to disrupt themselves and come up with new ideas. So this is a book that I'm currently listening to. It's called The Patient Will See You Now. And basically what the book talks about is flipping the model of the patient and the healthcare. So instead of having a reactive method of waiting until you get sick and going to the doctor, it focuses on prevention, focuses on leveraging, for example, AI for diagnostics. There's genome tracing, etc., that we can actually use in healthcare that is focused on prevention. And so when that happens, the healthcare insurance industry will be definitely negatively impacted, because it is based on scarcity model. It's based on, let's 1,000 people pay us a certain amount every month, and we hope that 5 people will get sick. So it's actually that won't be working in the long term. There is a need for innovation and disruption here. So this is the final example I'm going to talk about. So if you don't have any questions, I can move into this, and then we can have the Q&A session. So how are these corporate innovation models implemented? What is the best practices? So elements for success, like any project, leadership support is required. So if you don't have the support of the board, the support of the CEO, you're most likely going to fail in this initiative, no matter how innovative or disruptive the idea is. Leadership support is crucial. You need to have clear strategic guidance about what innovation teams should be working on. Think about alignment of your company strategy and also your innovation strategy. Where is the alignment? Is this a vision for your company? Is this something they want to enter in? Is this the market they want to enter in, etc.? Does it make sense to them? And then a really important point here is have small investments in multiple ideas. I've seen many CEOs telling their teams, we want you to come up with an Uber-like idea, especially when Uber started to become famous a few years ago, like 5-6 years ago. They were really threatened by, how Uber-like companies can disrupt their industry. So they tell their teams, come up with an idea and I'll give you $1 million to implement it. But it doesn't work like that, because the success of startups comes from their ability to be resourceful with their money, ability to find ways to reduce costs, really think creatively. And working in those challenged environments is what sparks the creativity and the innovation. And when you're trying to tell your employees, come up with an idea, implement it inside the company, and I'll give you $1 million, it doesn't really work. So the idea is to have small investments in multiple ideas, have like 6-7 ideas, small investments like $50,000, and put the teams outside of the company to work on them in a lab or somewhere that they can have complete autonomy, so that they don't be interrupted or distracted by the immune system. See what they can do with the $50,000, and then if they fail, they fail. But if they succeed, they'll tell you, okay, we need another 50,000 or 100,000. Then you can start investing more in those ideas, and maybe one of those ideas will be a hit. Failure is okay, but failing cheaply is also important. And then there's strategic collaborations, right? So you could have collaborations with the ecosystem, you could have collaborations with other accelerators, with startups, etc. Now, the models out there are different models. So the ones I've spoken about are those, is just one example of innovation models within companies. But then there are innovation labs. So you probably heard about Tilco and Brink, for example, having a corporate accelerator, completely different, separated from the company, that comes up with, works with startups with different ideas. And that's one model of innovation. The other one is innovation challenges and hackathons, where companies come up with challenges and then they see, who can solve this challenge. And then you have the startup and corporate partnerships, where I've worked in the space where we facilitated the access to corporate clients for startups, because this is a big challenge for them. Startups don't have access to corporates. They don't have the trust that they need, or the brand name that companies can help them with. So that's kind of startup and corporate partnerships is also another model. Then you have the investments, acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions, and the corporate venture capitalists. So these are all types of investments where companies try to define the area they want to invest in and look for startups, and they invest in them or they acquire them. Or you can have entrepreneurs in residence. So many entrepreneurs will say, for example, that I've worked, I started my own company, I exited the company, and now I want stability, I want security, I want to work for a company, for example. And a lot of entrepreneurs exist in this space. And so companies hire them as entrepreneurs in residence in order to gain their experience in entrepreneurship. Or they could be entrepreneurs that are currently running their own companies but can provide part-time support for these companies. So an example of the hackathons and the challenges, this is a company based in France. It's called Agorize. So Agorize has open challenges. If you're a big company, you can go there, open an account, have pay a certain amount, and then post your challenge. And you can see here, for example, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, has a challenge, and they invite individuals and startups to come up with ideas that will solve their problem. And one of the things Agorize did is worked with Louis Vuitton, and Louis Vuitton was aiming to recruit around 40 employees that are postgraduates. And so what they did is they launched a challenge, and they had over 750 participating students from 6 different countries. And they wanted them to solve these challenges, to hire them not only based on their CV, but also based on their abilities to solve these problems. Another example is Microsoft for Startups, and this exists here in the GCC region. It's the Growth X Accelerator, where they facilitate partnerships of startups and large corporations. So the final thought I will end up with here is that there's a huge potential to solve big problems. There are unused spaces. There's over 220 million unemployed individuals in the world. There are over 3 million homeless and over 18 million unused homes. So there's just the potential to do so much, and that even goes beyond the things I've mentioned here. So I wanted to think about what kind of problems do you want to solve in the world, and hopefully you can be part of that. So thank you very much. I'm sharing my email and my LinkedIn if you want to connect with me.